We have been waiting for so long, and they are finally here.
The Versailles arrived not with fire but with silence. 600 vessels sliding into the outer dark of the solar system, with engines so quiet that Earth's deep space listening arrays almost missed them entirely. And for 3 days, humanity did not know whether it was looking at an invasion or an omen. Dr. Naomi Osai, senior xenolinguist at the newly formed Threshold Institute, stood in the observation deck of Farside Station on the Moon and watched the alien fleet resolve, ship by ship, out of the void on the long-range feeds, and she felt none of the terror the news broadcasts back on Earth were already beginning to manufacture. She felt something stranger, a kind of recognition, though she could not yet have said of what. The Versailles ships did not look like weapons. They looked like instruments, vast curved hulls the color of old amber, etched from bow to stern with patterns that shifted and rearranged themselves in slow, deliberate cycles. And when the first transmission finally came through, 3 days after the fleet's arrival, it was not a demand or an ultimatum. It was a question, rendered by the ship's own translation matrix into halting, uncertain English. What is it, the message asked, that you are for? The Versailles, humanity would come to learn over the desperate, disorienting weeks that followed, were an old species, older even than the Kryx empires human diplomats would encounter a full generation later, and they had spent the better part of 11,000 years doing something no other spacefaring civilization in the region had ever attempted. They had gone from world to world not to conquer, but to judge, carrying with them a standard so exacting and so alien to the intuitions of younger species that every civilization they had encountered before humanity had eventually been found wanting. Their judgment was not cruel in the way that word implied to human ears. It was worse, in its way, because it was patient. A species found wanting was not destroyed. It was simply left alone, sealed within its own system by fields of dormant but instantly reactivable interdiction drones, permitted to live out its existence in isolation, cut off forever from the wider galaxy, judged unready, and therefore undeserving of the company of other minds. 41 civilizations had received this verdict in the 11,000 years the Versailles had been making their slow, terrible circuit of the stars. Not one had ever been unjudged. Not one had ever been given a second chance. The criteria for judgment, as far as human intelligence agencies could piece together from the fragments of Versailles communication and the accounts of two other species who had, centuries before, encountered the Versailles fleet and lived to warn their neighbors, were not military. They were not even, in any straightforward sense, moral. The Versailles did not care whether a species was violent or peaceful, whether it had fought wars or avoided them, whether its history was soaked in blood or largely bloodless. What the Versailles cared about, the thing they had spent 11,000 years searching the galaxy to find and had not yet found anywhere, was something closer to a philosophical question than a political one. Whether a species, having achieved the power to remake its environment and eventually the stars themselves, could still find a reason to live inside that power that was not, at its root, a reason built from fear. Every civilization they had judged and found wanting, the records suggested, had organized itself in the end around some version of the same architecture. Hierarchies built to manage scarcity, cultures built to manage threat, governments built to manage the fundamental, gnawing suspicion that survival was a zero-sum proposition, and that joy, where it existed at all, was a luxury purchased at someone else's expense. The Versailles were not looking for utopias. They understood, better than most, that no species built anything close to utopia. What they were looking for, and had not yet found, was a civilization capable of choosing generosity even when it was not strictly required to, of building beauty that served no defensive purpose, of finding, somewhere in the architecture of its own survival, room for something that looked like unearned kindness. In the first 72 hours after the fleet's arrival, before Threnodi's first transmission reached Farside Station, Earth's governments did what governments facing an unexplained alien fleet had always done in the 2 centuries since first contact with anything beyond the solar system. They prepared for the worst. Military strategists who had cut their teeth in the Kryx War, men and women who had spent a decade rebuilding human defenses from the exhausted wreckage of that earlier conflict, drew up contingency plans with a speed that spoke to muscle memory rather than confidence, dusting off doctrine that had not been needed in years and hoping, without much conviction, that IT would not be needed now. Civilian populations, remembering the Kryx invasion with the particular vividness that trauma imprints on a species that has survived it once already, began quiet, informal evacuations toward the deep shelters and colony ships that had never quite been decommissioned, built during the war and maintained ever since out of a caution that no peacetime budget committee had ever successfully argued away. In the Meridian Belt resettlement colonies, where the scars of the earlier war ran deepest, families who had rebuilt their lives twice already began, wearily and without much hope of a third rebuilding, to pack the few possessions that had survived the first 2 calamities. Admiral Voss, watching the early news broadcasts from her hillside farm before the council's summons reached her, felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, not the old cold clarity of a mind already running survival mathematics, but a kind of exhausted, bone-deep reluctance. The reluctance of someone who has already paid an unbearable price once and cannot yet fathom finding the strength to pay it again. She sat with that reluctance for 2 full days before the council's message arrived, and when it did, she found herself hoping, in a way she barely admitted even to herself, that whatever waited for her in that chamber would not require her to become, a second time, the version of herself she had spent a decade trying to set down. Admiral Elena Voss, 11 years retired from active command and living a quiet life on a modest hillside farm outside what had once been the Kryx-scarred wreckage of the Meridian Belt evacuee resettlement zone, was summoned back to advise the newly formed Unified Earth Council within a week of the Versailles arrival, not because anyone expected her to fight this war, but because she was, by that point, the only living human being who had personal, hard-won experience negotiating with a spacefaring civilization from a position of total strategic disadvantage. She sat in the council chamber, older now, her hair gone fully gray, her hands steadier than they had been in the war's final years, and she listened to 3 days of increasingly frantic military briefings proposing defensive postures, evacuation contingencies, last-ditch weapons programs scavenged from Kryx War technology that Earth had captured and reverse-engineered in the years since the peace. She let the briefings run their course, because she understood, better than the younger officers presenting them, the particular comfort that comes from planning a fight even when the fight itself is not the one that matters. When the briefings finally ended and the council chairman turned to her, visibly hoping she would offer some version of the ruthless, war-winning cunning that had saved humanity once before, Voss said only this, that she did not believe the Versailles could be fought, because as far as she could tell from the intelligence gathered so far, they had not come to fight. She said that the last time she had faced an overwhelming alien fleet, she had needed to become something harder and colder than the enemy in order to survive, and she did not believe, whatever the council wanted to hear, that the same strategy would save them this time, because the thing being tested was not humanity's capacity for ruthlessness, which she knew, with the certainty of someone who had lived it, was not in short supply. The thing being tested was whether that ruthlessness was the only thing humanity had. It was Dr. Naomi Osai, not the council's military staff, who ultimately shaped humanity's response, because it was Osai who spent the first 6 weeks of contact doing the slow, unglamorous work of actual translation, sitting for hours at a time in front of a communication array on Farside Station, building a working vocabulary with the Versailles emissary through patient trial and error, the same way any 2 strangers with no shared language eventually learn to understand each other. through pointing, through repetition, through the thousand small failures that precede any real communication. The early sessions were, by Osai's own later account, almost comically slow. The Versailles translation matrix, sophisticated as it was, had been built from centuries of contact with dozens of other species, and carried with it linguistic assumptions that did not map cleanly onto human grammar, so that entire afternoons were sometimes spent establishing something as basic as the difference between a question and a statement, or the human habit of using the same word to mean opposite things depending on tone and context. A quirk that seemed to genuinely fascinate the being on the other end of the connection. Os kept a private journal throughout those early weeks, not for any official record, but because she had learned, over a career spent doing exactly this kind of patient, uncertain work on a dozen other worlds, that the small human habit of writing things down helped her think, and she filled page after page with observations that would later prove more valuable to the council than any formal intelligence briefing. That Threnody paused, consistently, for a beat longer than the translation lag required whenever a human concept touched on loss. That the emissary's questions, however halting, never once repeated themselves, suggesting either a perfect memory or a discipline of attention that Osai found, in its own way, humbling. That there was something in the rhythm of Threnity's communication, some quality she could not quite name even after weeks of study, that reminded her less of a diplomat conducting an assessment and more of someone who had been waiting, for a very long time, for a conversation they had stopped expecting to have. The Versailles emissary, a being whose name resolved, after weeks of imperfect translation, into something closest to the human word threnody, was patient in a way that unsettled Osai at first, because it did not feel like the patience of diplomacy. It felt like the patience of someone watching a slow and inevitable outcome unfold, someone who had already seen this particular story before, 41 times, and expected, without any real hope of surprise, to see it unfold the same way again. Osai asked Threnody, in the 7th week of contact, once their shared vocabulary had grown sturdy enough to support a genuinely difficult question, what exactly the Versailles were looking for, and Threnity's answer, translated through a system that Osai had come to trust but never fully understand, was the closest thing to an unguarded statement the alien had offered in 7 weeks of careful, formal exchange. Threnody said that the Versailles had watched 41 species reach for the stars, and that every one of them, in the final analysis, had reached for the stars the way a drowning creature reaches for a branch, out of fear, out of the desperate hope that expansion would finally silence the anxiety that had driven their civilizations from the very beginning, the anxiety of scarcity, of vulnerability, of a universe that might, at any moment, take everything away. Every one of those 41 species had built magnificent things, cities that spanned continents, art that Threnody, in a rare and startling admission, described as beautiful enough to have moved even a being as old and as weary as itself. But underneath all of it, in every single case, Threnody said, was the same foundational architecture. Survival first, and everything else, including kindness, including joy, including the strange and costly generosity of caring for someone who could offer nothing back, built as an afterthought on top of that foundation, always secondary, always negotiable, always the first thing sacrificed when the foundation itself came under threat. Osai brought this conversation to the council, and she brought with it a proposal that struck the military staff as, at best, naive and, at worst, suicidal. That humanity should not attempt to hide the worst of its history from the Versailles judgment, should not curate some sanitized highlight reel of human achievement designed to present the species in its most flattering light, because the Versailles, judging by their own account, had already seen every version of that performance 41 times before and had never once been fooled by it. Instead, Osai argued, humanity's only genuine chance, however slim, lay in doing something almost no civilization under judgment had apparently ever attempted. Total, unguarded honesty about exactly what humanity was, including the war against the Kryx, including the mathematics of unacceptable loss, including the new Kinshasa tunnels and the nuclear mines and every terrible calculation Admiral Voss had made to keep her species alive, laid out not as an excuse but as an unflinching account of what fear had made of them, offered alongside, and given no more weight than an equally unflinching account of everything humanity had built and chosen, and protected that fear alone could not explain. The council debated this proposal for 4 days, and the debate itself, Osai would later reflect, revealed almost as much about humanity's readiness for judgment as anything the Versailles would eventually observe. General Priya Rajagopal, who had commanded the council's defense staff since the end of the Kryx War, and who had spent 4 decades building doctrine around the assumption that vulnerability, however honestly presented, was a weakness an adversary would inevitably exploit, argued forcefully against Osai's proposal, warning that total disclosure of humanity's worst moments, offered to a species with the power to seal Earth off from the stars forever, was not honesty but a kind of unilateral disarmament, a gift handed to a judge with no evidence that the judge intended mercy. She was not wrong to be afraid, and Osai never claimed otherwise. The fear in that chamber was the same fear Vo SS had spent a war learning to wield, the fear that had built every defense humanity possessed, and it did not evaporate simply because the enemy this time carried no visible weapons. Counselor Ibrahim Farouk, representing the reconstituted Meridian Belt colonies, spoke for nearly an hour about what New Kinshasa's survivors would feel, watching their governor's death and the deaths of 9,000 of their neighbors laid bare before an alien tribunal with the power to condemn the species that had asked them to make that sacrifice. And he asked the chamber, more than once, whether honesty demanded by fear of a different, more sophisticated kind of judgment was really so different from the honesty demanded by fear of Kryx guns. Nobody in the chamber had a clean answer to that question, and Osai did not pretend to have one either. It was, in the end, Voss herself who tipped the balance, though not in the way anyone expected. She stood before the assembled council, the woman who had ordered the sacrifice of 16,000 civilians and the reactor overload deaths of 23 volunteer crews, and she said that she had spent 11 years since the Kryx War trying to answer a question that Fleet Marshal Threxa Van Cor had asked her in the final hours of that conflict, a question about whether humanity possessed any threshold at all, any point past which it would refuse to go no matter the cost of refusing. She said she had never found a satisfying answer to that question, because the war itself had never given her the luxury of testing one, every choice reduced, in the end, to survival or extinction with nothing in between. She said that whatever the Versailles were actually looking for, she suspected it was not a species without ruthlessness, because she doubted such a species could survive long enough to reach the stars in the first place, but a species that had ruthlessness and chose, when the choice was actually available to it, not to reach for it first. She said that for the first time in her adult life, she was being offered a genuine choice rather than a survival calculation, and she recommended, with a conviction that surprised even her, that the council take it. What followed was not a negotiation in any conventional sense, because there was, as far as anyone could determine, nothing to negotiate. The Versailles were not asking for tribute or territory or technology or any of the concessions a conventional invading force might demand. They were asking, in the only way a species 11,000 years into an unbroken pattern of disappointment knew how to ask, to be shown something they had not yet seen, and humanity's task, if it could be called a task at all, was simply to exist in front of them honestly, for as long as it took the Versailles to render their verdict. The Versailles fleet remained in the outer dark for 14 months, a period that human historians would later call, with a certain grim irony given how the previous alien encounter had gone, the long watching, and it was a period defined not by dramatic confrontation, but by an accumulation of small, unguarded moments that no strategist could have planned or manufactured. In the early months of the long watching, an exercise in a very particular kind of anxiety, the anxiety of being observed without knowing, moment to moment, what was being seen or how it was being weighed, shaped public discourse in ways the council had not fully anticipated when it committed to Osai's disclosure proposal. Public discourse fractured along lines that would have been familiar to any student of human history under existential pressure. Some argued that the honest disclosure strategy was a catastrophic error, that humanity should be presenting its best face rather than its most complete one, and organized, in the fourth month, a series of demonstrations outside council buildings on 3 continents demanding a change in policy. Others argued the opposite, that the council's disclosures had not gone far enough, that true honesty required surfacing every uncomfortable chapter of human history, and not merely the war against the Kryx, and pushed, with the particular fervor of people convinced that suffering performed publicly was suffering redeemed, for an ever-expanding catalog of confession that Osai, watching from Farside Station, privately worried was becoming its own kind of performance, a fear dressed up as virtue. She raised this concern with the council directly, arguing that the Versailles were not asking for a catalog of sins at all, that Threnodi's questions had never once solicited confession, only observation, and that manufacturing displays of contrition for an audience that had explicitly said it was not looking for perfection risked becoming exactly the kind of performance the Versailles had spent 11,000 years learning to see through. It was in trying to answer these questions honestly, rather than strategically, that the council began to understand what Osai had been arguing from the beginning, that the honest answer to almost every question the Versailles asked was going to be messier and less flattering than any curated response might have offered, but that the mess itself was, apparently, exactly what the Versailles had spent 11,000 years failing to find anywhere else. Threnody asked why a species capable of the new Kinshasa tunnel collapse, capable of turning its own ships into kinetic weapons crewed by volunteers who understood exactly what they were being asked to do, also produced, in the same generation, the kind of unremarkable, everyday generosity that Versailles observation systems had documented by the billions of instances across human history. Strangers giving up seats on crowded transport for people they would never see again, communities rebuilding, unasked and unpaid, the homes of neighbors who had lost everything in disasters that owed nothing to war, an entire global tradition, spanning every human culture the Versailles had studied, of caring for the dying with a tenderness that offered no survival benefit whatsoever to the society providing it. Osai did not have a clean answer to this question. She told Threnody, in the 9th month of the Versailles' presence in the solar system, that she suspected the two things were not actually in contradiction, that the same capacity that let humans do terrible things under existential threat was, in some way she did not fully understand herself, connected to the same capacity that let them do extraordinary, unnecessary kindnesses when the threat was not present. That both were expressions of a species that felt everything very intensely, and had never quite figured out how to feel only the acceptable, convenient parts of that intensity. Dr. Amara Chen, who had served as Voss's medical officer through the darkest years of the Kryx War, and had spent the decade since building and running a network of trauma recovery clinics across the resettlement colonies, was asked, in the early months of the long watching, to speak with Threnody about a subject the council had initially hesitated to raise at all. The psychological cost the war had exacted on the people who survived it, not the dead whose names filled Voss's ledger but the living, who carried their own quieter, less visible wounds into every year that followed. Chen agreed to the conversation without hesitation, though she told Osai beforehand, in the blunt, unadorned way she had always spoken about difficult things, that she did not know how to make suffering sound like anything other than what it was, and that she did not intend to try. She told Threnody about the sleepless nights that had followed her 3 days aboard the hospital ship Mercy, about the gunnery officers and pilots who had come to her clinics 20 years later still unable to sleep without medication, still startling at sounds that resembled, even faintly, the particular pitch of a hull breach alarm. She told Threnody about a form of grief she had seen appear, again and again, in survivors of the new Kinshasa bombardment, a grief that did not resolve so much as it changed shape over years, becoming for some a kind of permanent watchfulness, and for others, more rarely and more remarkably, something closer to a fierce and deliberate tenderness, as though having witnessed the absolute worst the universe could offer, they had decided, consciously and with real effort, to spend whatever life remained to them building the opposite. Chen said she did not fully understand why some survivors moved toward the first outcome and some toward the second, that she had spent a career trying to understand it, and had never found a formula that reliably predicted which way a given person would go. But she said that the clinic she ran existed, in the end, to try to tilt the odds, gently and imperfectly, toward the second outcome, because she had come to believe, watching thousands of survivors over 10 years, that the tenderness was available to nearly everyone, given enough patience and enough support, and that the watchfulness, however understandable, was rarely a place anyone actually wanted to live. Threnady's questions in this exchange were, Osai noted afterward, longer and more numerous than in almost any other session of the long watching, as though the emissary had recognized in Chen's account something it had been struggling, across 11,000 years and 41 prior judgments, to properly categorize. Threnody asked whether the clinics Chen ran were considered, within human society, a cost the species bore reluctantly, a tax paid grudgingly because law or custom required it. And Chen told the emissary no, that the opposite was closer to true, that the clinics were chronically underfunded not because humanity begrudged the spending, but because human institutions were, like institutions everywhere, imperfect and slow to prioritize invisible wounds over visible ones, and th. At the actual practice of the work, the daily reality of it, was carried out by people who had, in most cases, chosen the profession freely and would have chosen it again, because there was something in the work itself, something Chen struggled to translate even in her own language, that felt less like sacrifice and more like the only sane response to having survived something enormous, to spend the survival on someone else's behalf. It was this conversation, more than any single account of a specific atrocity or a specific kindness, that Osai would later come to believe had done the most to shape the Versailles' final understanding of what they were actually looking at, because it suggested something the emissary's careful, patient study of individual data points had perhaps struggled to capture on its own. That the two halves of humanity's character, the ruthlessness and the tenderness, were not simply coexisting in uneasy parallel, but were, in some deep and structural way, feeding each other, that the same species capable of building nuclear mines to hide in asteroid fields was also capable of building, over 10 exhausting years, an entire infrastructure devoted to helping its own survivors learn to feel safe again, and that neither capacity fully made sense without the other standing beside it. The 7th month of the long watching brought the crisis that nearly unraveled the entire approach, a moment that Osai would later describe as the closest humanity came, during the Versailles judgment, to reverting entirely to the architecture of fear that had carried it through the Kryx War. A fringe political movement calling itself the Vigilant Compact, drawing on the raw and still unhealed trauma of the earlier invasion, seized control of a regional government in the reconstituted North American Administrative Zone, and in a move that horrified the Council, began constructing unauthorized weapons platforms disguised as agricultural infrastructure. Convinced that the Versailles patient observation was itself a prelude to invasion, and that humanity's only honest response to any alien presence, whatever its stated intentions, was to prepare, quietly and without waiting for permission, to fight. The council learned of the platforms only when a routine Versailles inquiry, delivered through Threnody with what Os read, even through the imperfect medium of translation, as something close to disappointment, asked why humanity's public commitment to honest disclosure appeared to exclude military construction happening in direct contradiction of it. Admiral Voss was the one who ultimately traveled to the Vigilant Compact's territory, not as a military officer, but as the person whose own history gave her, however imperfectly, the standing to make the argument that needed making. She stood before the movement's leadership, people who had lost family in the Kryx War just as she had, people whose fear she understood in her own bones because she had carried a version of it herself for over a decade, and she told them the truth as plainly as she had ever told it to anyone. That she, more than perhaps anyone alive, understood the impulse to meet an unknown threat with prepared violence, that she had built her entire wartime reputation on exactly that impulse, and that she had come to believe, slowly and at great personal cost, that the impulse, however understandable, was not wisdom, but only the echo of an old wound reasserting itself whenever the world offered it an excuse. She did not order them to stand down, because she no longer held any authority to order anyone to do anything. She asked them, instead, whether they believed the alternative to fear was naivety, and she told them that she had spent 10 years discovering that it was not, that a species could remain entirely capable of defending itself while still choosing, when the choice was genuinely available, not to let that capability be the first and only thing it reached for. The Vigilant Compact dismantled its platforms within the month, not because Voss had defeated them in any conventional sense, but because enough of their own members recognized, in her account of her own history, something closer to their own fear than they were comfortable admitting, and chose, in the end, to set it down. The incident was folded, honestly and without concealment, into the Council's ongoing disclosure to the Versailles, and Threnady's response, when it came, surprised even Osai, who by that point had spent the better part of a year learning to expect the emissary's particular brand of patient, uneasy grace. Threnody said that every previous species under judgment had, at some point in the process, produced a moment very much like the Vigilant Compact, a resurgence of the old architecture reasserting itself under pressure, and that in every one of the 41 previous judgments, that resurgence had marked the beginning of the end, the point at which the fear reclaimed whatever ground the species' softer instincts had briefly won. What none of those 41 species had ever done, Threnody said, was resolve the resurgence the way humanity had resolved it. Not through suppression, not through the Council exercising force to dismantle the movement before the Versailles could observe it, but through the slow, unglamorous work of one frightened person persuading other frightened people, in good faith and without coercion, to choose differently. Threnody said this had never happened before, in 11,000 years of watching, and Osai, reading the translated words on her console late that night on Farside Station, found that she had to set the message aside for several minutes before she could bring herself to answer. Voss herself did not speak publicly about the Vigilant Compact visit for years afterward, and when she finally did, in a brief interview conducted for a historical archive project long after the judgment had been rendered, she described the drive back from that regional government's territory as one of the longest of her life, not because of the distance, but because of the silence in the vehicle, hours spent alone with the knowledge that she had just done something she was not at all certain would work. Using an authority she no longer technically possessed to ask people who had every reason to distrust reassurance to trust it anyway. She said she had thought, more than once during that drive, about how strange it was that the skill which had finally proven useful in that moment was not the ruthless tactical clarity that had won the Kryx War, but something much older and much less celebrated. The plain, patient work of sitting across from frightened people and telling them the truth about her own fear, until they recognized enough of themselves in her account to consider, just for a moment, that there might be another way to hold it. She said she had not been trained for that kind of work, had spent a career being trained for exactly the opposite, and that learning it late, imperfectly, and entirely by necessity had been one of the strange and unlooked-for gifts of the years since the war. A second education she had never asked for and had come, in time, to be grateful for. The months that followed the vigilant compact crisis settled into something closer to the quiet, accumulating pattern the long watching would eventually become known for. A rhythm of small exchanges and small revelations that rarely made headlines but that Osai, watching the pattern build month after month from her post on Farside Station, had come to believe mattered more, in aggregate, than any single dramatic confrontation could have. Threnodi's questions grew, over these months, less formal and more curious in a way that felt, increasingly, less like an assessment, and more like genuine conversation between two people who had simply started out, through no fault of either, on opposite sides of an examination table. The emissary asked about human humor, struggling for weeks to understand why a species would deliberately construct a story only to subvert its own expectations for the pleasure of the subversion. And Os spent an entire session failing to adequately explain a joke before giving up and simply telling Threnody three more badly, until something in the emissary's careful, patient questions suggested that amusement, or something functionally similar to it, had finally arrived. The emissary asked, in a quieter and more hesitant exchange, whether humans ever felt lonely in the particular way that came from being very old and having outlived the urgency that once organized their lives, a question that startled Osa enough that she did not immediately have an answer, and it was only much later, turning the question over during a sleepless night, that she understood she had been asked, however obliquely, something close to a confession, and that Threnody, 11,000 years into a search that had disappointed it 41 times, might have been asking, in the only language available to it, whether the loneliness of the search itself was something a much younger species could recognize at all. Admiral Voss in the 10th month was asked by Threnody, through Osai's translation, to explain in her own words the reasoning behind the new Kinshasa evacuation, and the request came, Osai later noted, on a day that seemed, in retrospect, almost deliberately chosen. The anniversary, by the old wartime calendar, of the tunnel collapse itself, though whether the Versailles observation systems had calculated that timing on purpose or simply arrived at the question through their own patient process of working through humanity's history in roughly chronological order, Osai was never able to determine. Voss traveled to Farside Station herself for the exchange, unwilling to let the account pass through any intermediary who had not lived it, and she sat in the small, unglamorous communications room where Osai had spent so many months building the fragile bridge of shared vocabulary that made the conversation possible at all. She gave, for the first time in a formal diplomatic setting, the same unflinching account she had once given privately to grieving families across a dozen worlds, including the numbers, including the names she still carried in a ledger she had never stopped adding to even in peacetime, including her own uncertainty, even now, about whether the choice had been the right one or only the least catastrophic among a set of choices that had all, in their own ways, been unforgivable. She described Governor Adami's face across the negotiating table, the particular quality of his silence before he asked how many of his people she expected to die. She described the 4 minutes of detonations in the asteroid channel, the 263 Kryx ships destroyed, and then, in the same steady voice, the 9,000 names that had been the price of that victory, reading a handful of them aloud, not because Threnody had asked for names specifically, but because Voss had decided, somewhere in the 11 years since the war ended, that numbers alone let a listener's mind slide past the weight of what they represented. And she was no longer willing to make that easy for anyone, including herself. She did not ask for absolution. She did not frame the account as a tragedy that circumstance had forced upon an otherwise gentle species, and when Threnody, through the translation matrix, asked whether she believed the sacrifice had been justified, Voss took a long moment before answering, long enough that Os began to wonder whether the question itself might be the one Voss had spent 11 years trying not to answer even in the privacy of her own mind. She said, finally, that she did not believe justified was the right word for anything that had happened during that war. That justification implied a kind of clean moral accounting she no longer believed existed, and that the only honest thing she could say was that she had made the choice she believed would kill the fewest people in total, and that she had been right about the arithmetic and had never once, in 11 years, stopped grieving the fact that being right about the arithmetic had still meant 9,000 people were dead, because of a decision she alone had made. She simply told the truth, the whole of it, and then she told Threnody something else, something that had taken her 11 years of quiet farm life to arrive at, and that she had never said aloud to anyone, including Dr. Chen, including the families she had visited. That she had spent every year since the war trying to build something that had nothing to do with survival, a garden on a hillside that produced more food than she needed, food she gave away to neighbors who had also survived the Kryx invasion, not because the giving served any strategic purpose, but because, for the first time since the war began, she had wanted to do something that cost her something and gave nothing back except the fact of having done it, and that this, more than any battle she had won, felt like the truest thing she had done with the life the war had left her. Threnady's response to this account when it came was not a judgment but a question, the same kind of careful, unhurried question the emissary had been asking for months, whether Voss believed the garden redeemed the ledger, whether the giving canceled the debt. Voss told Threnody no, that she did not think the two things worked on the same scale at all, that the garden did not make the ledger lighter and was never intended to, that she had simply reached a point, after enough years of carrying both, where she understood that a person could hold an unpayable debt in one hand and an ongoing, unearned generosity in the other, and that the second thing did not need to erase the first in order to be real. It was this answer, more than any other single exchange in 14 months of contact, that Osai would later learn had been flagged by the Versailles internal deliberative process as the closest thing to a decisive data point the judgment produced, though Threnody, true to form, gave no indication at the time that the conversation had been anything more than one more patient step in a very long process of watching. Some of the moments that mattered most in the end were the ones no strategist could have planned or manufactured. A schoolteacher in Lagos, unaware that her classroom's public educational broadcasts were among the millions of data streams the Versailles monitoring systems were drawing on, spent an ordinary Tuesday teaching 8-year-olds a folk song about a fisherman who gave away his catch to a stranger during a famine, a story with no historical basis and no practical moral beyond the simple, repeated insistence that the fisherman's family survived anyway, somehow, because kindness. The song insisted without any evidence beyond its own melody, had a way of coming back around. She had taught the same song every year for over a decade, long before any alien fleet had entered the solar system, not because any curriculum required it, but because she remembered her own grandmother singing it to her during a difficult season of her own childhood, and she had never once considered that the small, unremarkable act of passing it on to another generation of 8-year-olds might, one distant day, become part of the evidence weighed in judgment of an entire species. A hospice worker in rural Manitoba spent 11 consecutive nights sitting beside a dying stranger who had no family left to sit with him, holding his hand and reading aloud from a book of poetry he had once loved, work for which she was paid a modest wage that did not come close to compensating the actual weight of what she gave. And she later told a researcher compiling oral histories for the Council's disclosure archive that she had not thought of those 11 nights as remarkable in any way. That this was simply what the work required, that she had sat with dozens of strangers in the same way over the years and expected to sit with dozens more, and that it had genuinely never occurred to her that anyone, let alone a civilization 11,000 years old, might find something in that ordinary, unglamorous vigil worth traveling across the dark to observe. A group of teenagers in a resettlement colony built from the wreckage of the Meridian Belt, children who had grown up hearing stories about the tunnel collapse and the sacrifice their grandparents' generation had made, organized, entirely on their own initiative and without any adult oversight. An annual festival that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with simply being alive in a place their ancestors had nearly died defending. A festival of music and food and dancing that Versailles observation logs would later single out, in the formal record of judgment, as one of several thousand data points that had proven, in the aggregate, decisive. The festival had begun in its first year, as little more than a handful of friends deciding to mark the anniversary of the colony's founding with a shared meal, and it had grown, year over year, without any deliberate design, into something the entire colony now organized its calendar around, an occasion that made room in the same evening for the solemn reading of names from the tunnel collapse and for music loud and joyful enough to be heard 2 valleys away, as though the colony's children had arrived. On their own and without instruction, at exactly the answer Threnody would later tell the council the Versailles had spent 11,000 years failing to find anywhere else. That grief and joy did not need to take turns, that a people could hold both, on the same ground in the same breath, and call the result, simply and without contradiction, a life worth continuing. Threnady's final communication with the council came in the 14th month, delivered not as a formal proclamation, but in the same halting, careful English the emissary had used from the very beginning, as though even now, after 11,000 years and 42 judgments, the weight of the decision required a kind of linguistic humility that more confident phrasing might have betrayed. The council had gathered in full for the occasion, every member present in the chamber for the first time since the initial debate over Osai's disclosure proposal 14 months earlier, and Osai herself sat at the communications terminal that had become, over more than a year of patient work, almost an extension of her own hands, translating in real time for a room that had grown quiet in a way council chambers rarely managed. The particular silence of people who understand that the next several minutes will determine the shape of everything that follows. Threnody began not with the verdict itself, but with an account of the process that had led to it, a courtesy, Osai suspected, that the emissary extended because it understood, better than most diplomats of any species, that a judgment delivered without its reasoning was a judgment that could never truly be believed, only obeyed. Threnody said that the Versailles had, over 11,000 years, developed a private, informal name for the pattern they kept finding in every civilization they judged and found wanting, a phrase that did not translate cleanly into human language, but that Osai rendered, after long consultation, as the architecture of enough, the tendency of every civilization to build a version of itself, just barely capable of surviving its own fear, with nothing left over, no margin. No surplus capacity for anything that did not serve the fear directly. Threnody said that humanity had built the same architecture, under the same pressures, during the Kryx War, and that the Versailles had watched that war's aftermath with the same weary expectation they had brought to 41 Previal's judgments, certain they were about to witness the pattern complete itself, the fear calcifying into permanent structure, the ruthlessness Voss had wielded against the Kryx becoming the foundation on which all of humanity's future choices would be built. Threnody described, in more detail than the emissary had ever offered before, what that completion had looked like in each of the 41 prior cases, not naming the species involved, out of what Osai understood to be a kind of diplomatic discretion, extended even to civilizations long since sealed away, but describing the pattern itself with a specificity that made clear how closely the Versailles had studied it. Governments that grew more centralized and more suspicious of dissent in the decades following their own great crises, arguing that the crisis had proven the necessity of vigilance, and that vigilance, once justified, was never again fully relinquished. Economies that reorganized themselves around perpetual readiness, diverting resources that might once have gone toward art or exploration, or the unglamorous work of caring for the vulnerable into standing defenses against threats that, in most cases, never returned. Cultures that began, gradually and almost imperceptibly, to treat kindness itself as a species of naivety, something to be indulged in prosperous times, and abandoned the moment prosperity felt uncertain. Threnody said that this pattern had a terrible, seductive logic to it, because in every single case, the species in question could point to real dangers that justified real caution, and the tragedy the Versailles had observed, over and over, was not that the caution was unfounded but that it never learned to recede, never found a way to become merely one part of a fuller life rather than the entire architecture upon which that life was built. What the Versailles had not expected, Threnody said, and what no previous species in 11,000 years of searching had ever shown them, was a civilization capable of setting that architecture down once the emergency that required it had passed, not forgetting it, not pretending it had not happened. Voss's ledger, Threnody noted, had not been destroyed or hidden. It had been read in full by Versailles observation systems, every name recorded in that careful, unhurried handwriting still weighing on the woman who had written them a decade later. But alongside that unforgotten weight, the Versailles had found a hillside garden that gave its harvest away for no reason that served survival, a schoolteacher's folk song with no practical value, a hospice worker's 11 nights beside a stranger, a festival built by children who chose joy in the exact physical location where their grandparents had chosen desperate sacrifice. And Threnody said that in 11,000 years of judgment, the Versailles had never before found a species that could hold both of those things at once without letting one erase the other. Every previous civilization had eventually chosen. Either the fear consumed everything, hardening into the architecture of enough, or the softness was revealed under sufficient pressure to have been a fragile and temporary performance that fear swept aside the moment survival was genuinely threatened. Humanity, Threnody said, in the closest thing to open astonishment the emissary had displayed in 14 months of contact, appeared to have done neither. It had let the fear be exactly as large as the emergency required, and no larger, and had returned, with what looked to Versailles eyes like genuine and unforced relief, to the harder, less efficient, less defensible work of building things that gave without needing to receive. The Versailles fleet withdrew from the solar system 4 days later, its departure as quiet and as unspectacular as its arrival had been, engines fading back into the same distant dark from which they had first appeared, leaving behind no garrison, no treaty, no formal alliance, only a single standing invitation, transmitted in Threnady's careful English and addressed not to the unified Earth Council, but in a gesture that Os found more moving than any of the formal proceedings that had preceded it. To humanity itself. An open channel permanently maintained, through which any human being, not merely diplomats or officials, could reach a small Versailles delegation that would remain discreetly at the edge of the system, available to answer questions, to listen, to begin the slow work of building something neither species yet had a name for, not alliance exactly, not friendship exactly, but the tentative, unhurried beginning of two old and wounded civilizations deciding, cautiously, that they might have something worth learning from each other after all. The formal announcement of the judgment, when the council finally released it to the public 4 days after Threnady's communication, produced a reaction across human civilization that surprised even the officials who had spent 14 months preparing for every possible outcome except, it seemed, the one that had actually arrived. There was no triumphant parade of the kind that had marked the end of the Kryx War, no declared holiday, no orchestrated celebration, because the verdict itself resisted that kind of easy narrative. Humanity had not won a battle or defeated an enemy, had not proven itself superior to anything, had simply been seen, in its entirety, and found, on balance and against considerable odds, to contain enough of whatever the Versailles were searching for to be allowed to keep searching for the rest of it themselves. In the reconstituted Meridian Belt colonies, where the memory of New Kinshasa remained lost, the news arrived not as vindication but as something quieter and harder to name, a permission, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that the grief the colonies had carried for over a decade had not needed to be resolved or redeemed in order for something good to grow up alongside it. Councillor Farouk, who had argued so forcefully against full disclosure in the earliest days of the long watching, gave a brief public statement in which he admitted, with a candor that impressed even his political opponents, that he had been wrong to believe honesty about New Kinshasa would only ever be a liability, and that he had needed 14 months of watching his own species be honest about its worst moment to understand that the honesty itself, and not any careful management of it, had been the thing that mattered. Admiral Elena Voss received the news of the Versailles withdrawal on her hillside farm, standing among rows of vegetables that had, this particular season, produced far more than she or her neighbors could eat, and she did the only thing that felt adequate to the moment. She loaded a truck with the surplus and drove it, as she had done every harvest for the past decade, to the resettlement colony 2 valleys over, where the teenagers who had built their own unauthorized festival were already, months in advance, planning the next one. She did not gather the colony together to make an announcement, did not treat the moment as an occasion for speeches, because it did not feel, to her, like an occasion for speeches at all. She simply unloaded the truck, as she had done every harvest before this one, and let the colony's residents come find her the way they always did, drifting over in 2s and 3s, as word spread that the Admiral had arrived with more tomatoes than any household could reasonably use, and it was in the middle of this ordinary, unremarkable exchange. Handing a crate of vegetables to a teenager named Quame, who had been 3 years old during the tunnel collapse and had grown up entirely inside its aftermath, that someone finally asked her whether it was true, whether the Versailles had really decided to let them stay. Voss told him yes, and she watched something move across his face that she recognized, with a small, private ache, as the particular relief of someone who had spent his entire life bracing for a second catastrophe without ever quite admitting to himself that he was doing it. Quame asked her, with the blunt, unguarded curiosity of someone young enough not to have learned diplomatic caution yet, whether she thought humanity had actually deserved to pass, a question he asked while still holding the crate of tomatoes she had just handed him, his voice carrying the particular seriousness that only the young could manage without any hint of irony, and Voss considered the question for a long moment before answering, because she had learned, over 11 years of trying to build an honest life on the other side of a dishonest war, that questions like this one deserved better than a comfortable answer. She told him that she did not think deserved was quite the right word, any more than justified had been the right word for what she had done in the war, that she suspected the Versailles had not been looking for a species that deserved anything in the abstract, only a species that was still, after everything, trying, imperfectly and incompletely, to become something better than its worst moments, and that trying, as far as she could tell, was the only thing any of them had ever really had to offer. Quame seemed to turn this over for a while, and then he said, with the kind of simple clarity that Voss had come to associate with the young people who had grown up in the colony's shadow of grief, that he thought that sounded about right, and then he went to find his friends to help unload the rest of the truck, and Voss stood alone for a moment in the fading light, watching the colony's children carry crates of vegetables toward kitchens that would, that evening, feed more people than any single household had grown. And she found in that small and unremarkable scene something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, entirely uncomplicated. She did not think of the Versailles' departure as a victory in the way the war against the Kryx had been a victory, a hard-won survival purchased through the mathematics of unacceptable loss. She thought of it if she thought of it in terms of the old vocabulary at all, as something closer to a second chance, not from the Versailles, who had judged and departed and left the outcome entirely in humanity's own hands, but from herself, from the version of her that had once believed the war's ruthless arithmetic was the only language she would ever be fluent in again. She was wrong, it turned out, and she found, standing in the fading light of a harvest evening surrounded by neighbors who had survived what she had asked them to survive and had chosen, unprompted, to build joy on top of that survival anyway, that being wrong about this particular thing was the finest news she had received in 11 years. Dr. Naomi Osei kept the open channel to the Versailles delegation active for the rest of her career, and in the years that followed, as humanity slowly, imperfectly, began the long work of building whatever came after both the Kryx War and the Versailles Judgment, the channel became something far stranger and far more valuable than the diplomatic instrument it had been designed as. Scientists used it to exchange ideas with Versailles counterparts who had spent millennia studying questions human researchers had only begun to ask. Musicians, of all people, were among its most frequent users, drawn by a discovery that emerged almost by accident in the second year of open contact. That the Versailles, despite their long and weary history of judgment, had never stopped being moved by the specific, untranslatable texture of human song, and a small but growing tradition developed of human composers writing pieces intended, from the outset, for an audience that would never see the instruments that produced them, and would experience the music instead as something closer to a pattern of feeling, translated imperfectly across an unbridgeable gap between minds. Osei herself used the channel most often simply to talk, in the unhurried, meandering way that two people build a friendship, with Threnody, who she had come to understand, over more than a year of careful translation work, not as a judge, but as someone who had spent 11,000 years wanting very badly to find a reason to stop being one. She found herself returning, again and again, to something Threnody had told her in the earliest, most uncertain weeks of contact, back when neither of them had yet built enough shared vocabulary to trust that the other was being understood at all. Threnody had said that the Versailles did not judge civilizations on their capacity for violence, because every civilization capable of reaching the stars had, by definition, already proven that capacity beyond doubt, and there was no wisdom in judging a species for possessing a tool that survival itself had required it to forge. What the Versailles judged in the end was something much simpler and much harder. Not whether a species could fight, but whether, having fought, it could still remember how to put the weapon down and mean it. Whether the hands that had once done terrible, necessary things could still, afterward, learn to hold something gently, and whether a species that had tasted the particular clarity of ruthlessness, the seductive simplicity of a world reduced entirely to threat and survival, could choose, when the choice was finally its own, to want something more complicated and more fragile than winning. Humanity, across 14 months of unguarded observation and 11,000 years of accumulated Versailles disappointment, had shown them that it could, not perfectly, not without the weight of everything the war had cost still etched into the ledgers its survivors carried. But it had shown them a hillside garden, and a folk song, and a hand held through a stranger's final night, and an unauthorized festival built by children on the exact ground where their grandparents had nearly died, and a fringe movement that chose, in the end, to dismantle what it had built out of fear rather than defend it, and in the patient, exhausted, 11,000-year search of a species that had begun to wonder whether the thing it was looking for existed anywhere in the galaxy at all. That had turned out to be enough. Years later, long after the open channel had become an unremarkable part of daily human life, after musicians had grown accustomed to writing for an audience they would never see and researchers had grown accustomed to collaborators who thought in centuries rather than careers, Osei would sometimes be asked, by students at the institute that had grown up around her original work, What she believed the true difference had been between humanity and the 41 species that came before it. The thing that had finally let the pattern break. She never claimed to have a complete answer because she did not believe one existed, but she told them, each time, some version of the same modest observation. That she suspected the difference was not that humanity felt less fear, or fought fewer wars, or made fewer terrible choices under terrible pressure, but only that it had never quite managed to convince itself the fear was the whole story, that somewhere underneath every hardened doctrine and every ruthless calculation there had always remained, stubborn and inconvenient and impossible to fully suppress, an old and ordinary appetite for making something beautiful simply because beauty, unlike survival, had never needed a reason.